I'll never forget the sting of that night, the night my son's wedding became the clearest reminder that love can blind you until it hurts. The ballroom glowed with golden chandeliers, laughter rising over the string quartet, champagne flutes clinking in celebration. And me, I wasn't seated with the family, not even among old friends. I was led to the back, to the kitchen, like I was nothing more than hired help. I stood there for a moment, frozen, staring at the round tables draped in white linen, each centerpiece overflowing with roses I had paid for. Every detail in that room carried my fingerprints, decades of sacrifice. The wealth I built, the foundation I gave them. Yet I was hidden behind swinging doors, while strangers toasted my son's future. It was Harper who made it clear. Her smile was sweet for the guests, but when her eyes flicked toward me, the sweetness turned sharp. She told the staff to treat me like part of the kitchen crew, and Lucas, my only child, sat there, silent. Not once did he defend me. Not once did he acknowledge the humiliation burning through me like fire. I felt my chest tighten, not with grief this time, but with rage I fought to keep buried. My hands trembled as I picked at the napkin in my lap, trying not to let the tears show. Outwardly, I smiled faintly, as if nothing was wrong. Inside, I was already making a decision. Because what Harper and Lucas didn't know was that the very morning of their wedding, I held in my hands the final paperwork for a $28 million development deal. A deal they had been bragging about for months. A deal they believed would secure their future. While they paraded in front of Charleston society, I quietly stepped away, found a corner near the staff's coffee station, and made a call. One word from me, and that deal collapsed before the cake was even cut. They thought they'd buried me in the shadows of their new life. But that night, I began writing a new story, one where I wasn't the discarded mother, but the storm they never saw coming. And as I sat in that kitchen, listening to the laughter echo through the walls, I couldn't help but remember everything I had given up for this very son who had just betrayed me. When I was 38, my life shifted in a way I never expected. One quiet morning, the man I had built my world around was gone, leaving me with a mortgage, a half-finished dream, and a little boy who looked at me with wide, frightened eyes. Lucas was only 10, too young to understand what it meant to lose a father, but old enough to sense that everything had changed. I remember sitting at the kitchen table with bills spread out in front of me, my heart racing, my palms damp. I had two choices, crumble or fight. And for Lucas, I fought. I took the scraps of an idea, my sketches, my notebooks, the vision my husband and I once whispered about at night, and I turned it into a business. A design firm that started at that same kitchen table, with fabric samples stacked next to unpaid utility bills. Those early years were brutal. I worked long days and longer nights. I learned how to negotiate contracts by watching VHS tapes from the library. I drove an old car with no air conditioning so Lucas could have new cleats for Little League. He would sit beside me as I spread blueprints across the floor, asking innocent questions that made me smile through my exhaustion. He used to call my binder of invoices Mom's magic folder, because no matter how empty our pantry looked, somehow food always appeared on the table. And slowly, the business grew. From small home remodels to large commercial projects, people started to trust my name. I built Hayes & Co. not just as a firm, but as a promise that Lucas would never have to worry the way I did. Every milestone was for him. Every late night, every sacrifice, every ounce of pride I swallowed to win clients who doubted a young widow, all of it was for my son. That's why the sting at his wedding cut so deeply. To give so much, only to be hidden away as though I were an embarrassment, it was a cruelty I never saw coming. And worse, I began to notice something subtle but chilling Harper. She had a way of sliding her name forward and mine back. On brochures, my picture vanished. On press releases, my name grew smaller, then disappeared altogether. Piece by piece, Harper was rewriting the legacy I had bled for, until one day I realized I was being erased from the very company I built. And the more I tried to hold on, the more I felt the walls of isolation closing in. The change didn't happen overnight. It was slow, almost invisible at first, the kind of shift you notice only when it's already too late. One day, I walked into the office and saw a glossy new brochure laid out on the reception desk. Our firm's projects were displayed beautifully across the pages. But when I turned to the leadership section, my picture was gone. The founder's name, my name, had been reduced to a single line at the bottom, and Harper's smiling face was front and center. I remember holding that brochure in my hands, my stomach sinking. I asked Lucas about it later, but he brushed it off as a modern rebrand. His tone was casual, but it cut deep. Rebrand. As if my years of sacrifice were nothing more than an outdated logo. The same pattern began to seep into every corner of my life. At company dinners, I found myself seated further down the table, my voice drowned out by Harper's confident chatter. At board meetings, decisions were made before I ever walked into the room. Even in social circles, those tight-knit Charleston gatherings I once belonged to, I noticed the phone stopped ringing. Invitations came less often. Then, not at all. I realized Harper had woven a quiet narrative that I was tired, outdated, no longer relevant. Lucas's silence was the worst of it. My son, the boy I had sacrificed everything for, stood beside her in every photo, nodded along with every suggestion. He didn't speak against me, but he never defended me either. And sometimes, silence wounds more than words ever could. I tried to convince myself that I was imagining things, but then I noticed irregularities subtle at first, expense reports that didn't add up, company funds redirected without clear explanations, transactions that seemed unnecessary, yet always signed off with Harper's name attached. I may have been sidelined, but decades of building this business had taught me how to read numbers like a second language. The truth was there, hidden in plain sight. Harper wasn't just pushing me out socially. She was quietly siphoning influence and money, consolidating power in a way Lucas either couldn't see or refused to. That night, I sat alone in my study, the weight of betrayal pressing down on me. For the first time in years, I allowed myself to cry, not just for what I was losing, but for the realization that my own family had turned me into a stranger in the world I had built. But tears only last so long. Somewhere in the silence of that room, a different feeling began to stir. A small, steady flame of resolve. If Harper thought she could erase me, she had underestimated the woman who built Hayes & Co. from nothing. And that was the night I decided I would stop being silent. I would fight back. Resolve doesn't roar. Sometimes it whispers. That night, after discovering the irregularities, I didn't scream or call Harper out. Instead, I sat quietly, letting the flame of determination burn steady inside me. I had survived widowhood, raised a child alone, and built a business from nothing. I would not let my own daughter-in-law erase me without a fight. The next morning, I made a call I hadn't expected to make again, this time to Victor, an attorney who had been by my side since the earliest days of Hayes & Co. He was more than a lawyer. He was a friend who had seen me negotiate contracts at my kitchen table while Lucas did his homework nearby. When I told him what I suspected, he didn't dismiss it. He listened. He believed me. And then he said the words I needed most. "We'll take care of this quietly, but we'll take care of it." With Victor's help, I began securing what was mine. Accounts were shifted into new banks under my sole authority. Investments were restructured so that no decision could be made without my signature. I re-established control of my shares in Hayes & Co., making sure the balance of power tipped back into my hands. It was a delicate dance. Harper couldn't know what I was doing. Not yet. This was a game of patience and precision. In the office, I sought out staff who had been loyal to me from the beginning. The project manager who'd once pulled all-nighters with me. The assistant who knew my handwriting better than her own. Quietly, without fanfare, I asked questions, reviewed files, and cross-checked expenses. What I found confirmed my fears, and then some. Harper wasn't just pushing me aside. She was siphoning company funds through shell accounts, disguising them as vendor payments. Small amounts at first, then larger ones. Always just under the radar of anyone who wasn't paying close attention. The betrayal was staggering. Every dollar she skimmed was a dollar stolen from the company I had bled to create, from the legacy I had promised Lucas. And still, he said nothing, blind or willfully silent. I could not tell, but instead of despair, I felt something else: clarity. For the first time in months, maybe years, I remembered who I was. I was not the woman hidden in the kitchen at her own son's wedding. I was not the founder being erased from brochures. I was Eloise Hayes, a survivor, a builder, and now, a strategist. Victor and I mapped out every step with precision. The time for open confrontation had not yet come, but it would. And when it did, Harper would learn that I had been preparing my counterattack long before she thought she had won. As I tucked away the files and notes, my heart no longer raced with fear, but with a steady, controlled anticipation. The pieces were in motion, and soon, very soon, the wedding celebration that had humiliated me would set the stage for a confrontation neither Harper nor Lucas would ever forget. The reception carried on as though nothing had happened. Glasses clinked, music played, and guests laughed under the shimmering lights, unaware that beneath their feet, an earthquake was quietly forming. I sat still, my hands folded neatly in my lap, wearing the kind of smile society expects from a mother of the groom. No one noticed that every detail Harper boasted about: the floral arrangements, the wine selection, the designer gown had been purchased with money I had earned. I listened as Harper's voice floated through the room, dripping with pride, as though she had orchestrated everything on her own. She leaned close to a group of influential guests, telling stories about the new era of Hayes & Co. The way she spoke about the firm, my firm, you would think I had never existed. Lucas stood beside her, nodding, laughing at her jokes, eyes shining with trust. My son looked proud, and that pride wasn't for me. For a moment, my chest tightened again. But this time, it wasn't grief. It was a sharpened, steady anger, the kind that gives focus rather than chaos. I sipped my water slowly, letting the bitterness settle into resolve. I didn't need to interrupt Harper's performance. I didn't need to raise my voice or make a scene. She could enjoy her spotlight because when the lights dimmed, I would still be holding the power she thought she had stolen. I had already made the call that morning to cancel their $28 million deal, and now, as I sat there watching them, I began mentally lining up the next move's documents signed, audits triggered, funds secured, Victor was ready, my loyal allies were in place, and Harper didn't even realize the ground beneath her feet was about to crumble. Lucas smiled at me once across the room, as though checking whether I approved of the spectacle. I returned the smile, small and polite, the kind of smile that hides everything it knows. If he saw anything behind my eyes, he didn't linger long enough to question it. Every speech, every toast, every laugh only strengthened my resolve. They thought they had silenced me, erased me, tucked me away like some unwanted guest. But in truth, I was already setting the stage for their reckoning. When the last piece of cake was served and the last song faded, I would no longer be just the mother cast aside at her son's wedding. I would be the storm waiting just beyond the horizon, ready to break. And by the time it hit, they would never see it coming. The morning after the wedding, the headlines should have been about Lucas and Harper's grand affair, the glittering night they thought would secure their place in Charleston society. Instead, whispers began to ripple through the city like cracks in glass. The $28 million development deal everyone had been buzzing about gone, collapsed overnight. Investors were furious, contractors blindsided, and Lucas, my son, was left stammering with no explanation. I had given no explanation either. I didn't need to. My call had been enough. The satisfaction of knowing that with a single decision, I could undo months of Harper's boasting, it was a quiet triumph I savored alone over my morning coffee. But that was only the beginning. By noon, Victor and I had set the next steps in motion. Emergency audits were ordered on the firm's accounts. Every irregular transaction, every shell payment Harper had orchestrated was flagged. Quietly, discreetly, but with enough force to send tremors through the walls of Hayes & Co. I didn't need to expose her in front of society just yet. The numbers would do it for me. Lucas called that afternoon, his voice frantic. I let it ring. Harper sent a carefully worded email about family cooperation. I didn't reply. Instead, I watched as the pieces of their perfect image began to unravel. By the end of the week, I walked into the boardroom, the same boardroom where my name had once been whispered as an afterthought, and I took my seat at the head of the table. The air was thick with tension. Harper sitting tall with forced confidence, Lucas pale and restless beside her. They expected me to explain myself, to defend what I had done. Instead, I opened the folder Victor had prepared and laid it flat on the table. In that moment, I wasn't the mother cast aside in the kitchen. I wasn't the widow who once scrambled to keep the lights on. I was the woman who had built Hayes & Co., and I was about to remind them of it. I spoke calmly, almost gently, as I explained that the power of attorney they assumed they held no longer existed, that the shares Harper thought she controlled had been quietly secured back into my name, that, in fact, I held the majority interest in Hayes & Co., and every decision, every contract, every penny that moved would happen under my authority, not theirs. The color drained from Harper's face. Lucas tried to protest, but the words died in his throat. I could see it in his eyes, the dawning realization that the foundation of their grand plans had been built on sand. Then came the final blow. I revealed the audit findings, Harper's trail of embezzlement, masked as vendor payments, now laid bare. Gasps filled the room, the board staring at her in shock. Harper's carefully crafted mask cracked, and for the first time, she had no clever words, no sweet smile to hide behind. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. Power doesn't always shout. Sometimes it speaks in quiet, devastating certainty. When I stood, I felt taller than I had in years. I had taken back not only my company, but my dignity. The woman they thought they had erased was standing stronger than ever. And as I left that room, leaving Harper and Lucas to face the ruins of their own schemes, I knew this was not just the end of their plan. It was the beginning of my triumph. The weeks that followed were filled with whispers I didn't have to start. Word spread quickly through Charleston about the failed deal, about the audits, about Harper's trail of deceit. The woman who once floated through society luncheons with her chin high now avoided eye contact in the grocery store. Her name, once spoken with envy, had become a cautionary tale. Harper's reputation wasn't just bruised, it was shattered. Lucas didn't escape untouched. His phone calls became frequent, his voice softer than I remembered, tinged with something I had long waited to hear: remorse. He tried to explain, to justify, to ask for another chance to make things right. But I no longer felt the need to rescue him from his choices. Silence became my answer. Sometimes silence is the only language left when words have lost their meaning. I could have chosen reconciliation. I could have stepped back into their lives, smoothed over the cracks, pretended the betrayal never happened. But I had learned something vital. Dignity cannot be bargained away for the illusion of harmony. To return would have been to accept erasure, to accept being hidden again. And I would not do that, not after everything I had survived to reclaim myself. Instead, I chose independence. I poured energy back into the company I had built, not for Lucas anymore, but for myself. I reconnected with old friends I had been cut off from, walked into book clubs and charity events with my head high, no longer ashamed of the shadows Harper had tried to cast over me. At 72, I discovered that freedom doesn't always come from others giving you permission. It comes from drawing your own lines and refusing to step behind them again. When I think of Lucas now, it isn't with hatred, it is with sadness. Yes, but also with acceptance. He will have to live with the choices he made, and perhaps one day, he will truly understand the cost of silence. If there is one lesson my story offers, it is this: being kind does not mean being weak, and being forgiving does not mean surrendering your self-respect. Sometimes the greatest act of love you can give yourself is the courage to walk away, even from those you once would have sacrificed everything for. And now, I want to ask you, have you ever faced a moment where you had to choose between peace with others and peace within yourself? Share your story in the comments. Your voice matters. And if this story touched you, I invite you to like and share it, because you never know who may need to hear that it's never too late to reclaim your dignity.